The morning air in the small town was crisp as the first rays of sunlight peered through the windows of the corner diner. Inside, the comforting hum of the coffee machine filled the air, mingling with the clinking of plates and mugs as Sarah moved effortlessly between the tables, her apron tied around her waist with the familiar knot she'd tied thousands of times before. The diner was her world, warm, familiar, and quiet. She knew everyone's order before they spoke it, and the faces that filled the booths were the same ones she'd seen day after day. There was something peaceful in the routine, something that grounded her, especially on mornings like today when the diner felt more like a sanctuary than a workplace. It was early, and only a handful of regulars were scattered around the diner, sipping coffee and chatting softly about the weather or local gossip. Sarah had always prided herself on being a good listener, but not today. Today, she was a little distracted. Her thoughts were miles away, as they often were these days. Life wasn't perfect, but it was comfortable. She was a small-town waitress, making just enough to get by, with a few dreams tucked away in her heart for someday. But for now, it was enough. She didn't ask for much, just a peaceful life and to do some good in the world. Maybe that's why she noticed him when he walked in. He appeared out of nowhere, a man who hadn't been in the diner before. The door creaked open, and a man in his late 40s stepped inside, his broad shoulders hunched slightly, as if weighed down by something invisible. His clothes were dark, a thick overcoat that looked too warm for the season, and his hair, once neatly combed, now fell over his forehead in an unkempt manner. His eyes, though, were the first thing Sarah noticed, dull, like they hadn't seen light in days. There was a sadness in them, a quiet, aching sorrow that seemed to hang around him like a dark cloud. He walked to the counter slowly, as if unsure of where to sit, before finally choosing the farthest booth from the door, facing the wall. He ordered coffee, his voice low and distant, as though the weight of the world was pressing down on him. Sarah had seen her share of broken hearts and troubled souls over the years. It wasn't unusual for someone to walk in, nursing some kind of pain. But there was something different about this man. He didn't just look sad, he looked lost, like he had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. She had always believed in small acts of kindness, the kind that didn't require much effort but made a world of difference. A smile, a word of encouragement, a cup of coffee on a rainy day. That's how she had been raised. Kindness was a gift, something you gave freely, even if you didn't have much to give. She wiped down the counter absently, her eyes flicking back to the man in the booth. He was staring out the window now, the faintest tremor in his hand as he wrapped it around the mug. Sarah felt a strange pull to him, a need to do something, anything, to ease whatever pain he was carrying. It wasn't her place to ask, and she didn't know his story, but she could feel the grief radiating off of him. So, without a second thought, she grabbed a cup and poured a fresh cup of coffee, her movements steady and practiced. She added a sugar packet, placed a stirrer next to it, and, before she could second-guess herself, walked over to the booth. "Here you go," she said softly, placing the cup in front of him. The man looked up, surprised, as if he hadn't noticed her approach. His gaze was weary, but there was a flicker of confusion in his eyes as he met hers. "Thanks," he muttered, his voice rough, as though it hadn't been used much in the past few days. Sarah smiled gently, not saying anything at first. She knew better than to press someone when they were in pain. Instead, she simply turned to walk away, but not before leaving the tip jar on the table. She didn't expect him to leave anything, not from someone who looked so broken, but it was more for herself, a small gesture to let him know that he wasn't invisible. "Don't worry about the coffee," she added over her shoulder as she walked back to the counter. "It's on the house today." The man's hand froze halfway to the cup. He looked up at Sarah again, this time with a mixture of surprise and something else, something Sarah couldn't quite place, but it made her heart tighten. He didn't say anything, but she could see the slight nod of his head, a silent acknowledgement of her kindness. It wasn't much, she knew, but it was something. As the morning passed, Sarah continued her work, glancing back at the man now and then. He barely touched his coffee, but every time she saw him, he seemed a little more at ease, a little less burdened by the weight he was carrying. He had a distant look, but there was something about the way he held himself that made Sarah believe he wasn't beyond help, beyond reaching out. She couldn't explain it, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to change. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man stood up. He left a few bills on the table, a generous tip, and turned to leave, but before he reached the door, he stopped. He turned back to Sarah, who had been wiping down a counter, her thoughts still lingering on him. He didn't look at her directly but kept his head down as he approached. In his hand, he held a small slip of paper, which he placed on the counter without a word. Then, just as quickly, he walked out of the diner, disappearing into the early morning fog outside. Sarah stared at the paper for a moment, unsure of what it was or why it felt so important. She unfolded it gently, revealing a simple note written in neat handwriting. "You won't believe what's about to happen." Sarah furrowed her brow, unsure of what it meant. But somehow, deep down, she felt the weight of his words. It wasn't a note of gratitude, nor was it a typical goodbye. There was something in those words that made her heart race, something that made her wonder if this man, this grieving stranger, was about to change her life in a way she couldn't yet understand. She tucked the note into her apron pocket, not realizing that this small act of kindness, offering a cup of coffee, was the spark that would soon ignite a series of events that would forever alter the course of her life. The next morning, Sarah walked into the diner as the sun was still low in the sky, casting soft rays of light through the windows, filling the space with a warm glow. She had barely slept the night before, the stranger's note still burning a hole in her mind. "You won't believe what's about to happen." The words echoed through her thoughts, and no matter how hard she tried to shake them off, they lingered like a shadow over her peaceful routine. Her life had always been simple: work, home, repeat. But now, she couldn't help but feel like something was on the verge of changing, something big, something she wasn't ready for. She couldn't explain it, but the strange man and his cryptic message had awakened a restlessness inside her. Still, she pushed it to the back of her mind as she began setting up for the day's shift, pouring fresh coffee and getting the tables in order. As the morning passed, the diner filled with its usual assortment of customers. Regulars trickled in for their morning cup of joe, exchanging pleasantries with Sarah as she took their orders. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that today wasn't going to be just like any other day. She glanced at the clock, already anticipating the usual quiet moments between rushes, when she could relax for a minute. But then, at exactly 10:15 a.m., the door to the diner swung open again. A man stepped inside, but this time, he wasn't the grieving stranger from yesterday. Instead, he was tall and sharp-dressed, with a well-maintained suit and briefcase in hand. His appearance was a stark contrast to the worn-out patron Sarah was used to serving, and she immediately felt her pulse quicken. There was something about his demeanor that made him stand out in the small-town diner. He moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the room as if he knew exactly where he was headed. When his gaze landed on Sarah, he approached her with a polite nod and introduced himself. "Good morning. I'm David Grant. I'm looking for Sarah Miller," he said, his voice smooth and professional. His handshake was firm, but there was something unsettling about the way he spoke, something that made Sarah feel both intrigued and cautious. "That's me," Sarah replied, her heart racing as she tried to read his face. What could this man possibly want with her? "I believe you're familiar with a recent customer who came in yesterday. A man named James." "I'm his lawyer," David said, as though it was the most normal thing in the world. The name hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. She instantly remembered the man, the one she'd bought coffee for the day before, the one who had left her the cryptic note. But this wasn't making any sense. "James," she repeated, her voice shaky. "What do you mean? Is he all right?" David didn't seem fazed by her confusion. "James passed away unexpectedly yesterday evening," he said, his tone calm and matter-of-fact, but his words sent a chill through Sarah. The coffee pot slipped from her hand, landing with a dull thud on the counter as her mind raced to catch up. She had no idea what to say, her thoughts a blur. The man she'd shared a moment of kindness with was dead? How could that be? He had been so alive just the day before, so present, so full of grief. But death? It was almost too much for her to process. I'm sorry, but I don't understand. I just gave him coffee yesterday. We didn't talk much, but, what does this have to do with me? Sarah stammered, her voice trembling now. David was quiet for a moment, letting the silence hang in the air before he spoke again. There's something you need to know, Sarah. James left something behind, and he specifically mentioned you, he said, his eyes locking with hers. He made a decision that will affect your life in ways you can't even imagine. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she tried to make sense of what he was saying. Me? She asked, almost whispering. She had no connection to this man beyond a cup of coffee, a simple act of kindness. Why would he mention her? Why would he even care? David nodded. Yes. It's part of his will, he said, pulling out a folder from his briefcase and opening it carefully. He slid a document toward Sarah. This is the last will and testament of James Westbrook. Sarah's hands shook as she reached for the paper, unsure if she was ready to know what was about to be revealed. The document looked official, legal language she barely understood at first glance. But her eyes landed on one specific line, and her breath caught in her chest. It says here, that I'm a beneficiary, she asked in disbelief, her voice faltering. For what? David leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. James designated you as the primary beneficiary of his estate, he explained, his words slow, deliberate. His home, his business assets, and a significant financial sum, all of it. He wanted you to have it. Sarah could barely process the words. A part of her felt like she was living in a dream. How could this be real? Yesterday, she had been an ordinary waitress, doing her best to make ends meet, and now, today, she was being told that a total stranger had left her everything. The weight of the situation pressed down on her chest, and she felt like she might suffocate under it. I don't understand, she whispered, more to herself than to him. Why me? I didn't even know him. I didn't do anything special. David's face softened, a hint of something like sympathy in his eyes. You did more than you realize, Sarah. You showed him kindness when he needed it most. That meant the world to him. And in his final days, James decided that you were the one who deserved to inherit what he had. He was grateful for your simple gesture. For your humanity. And that's why he left everything to you. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Sarah sat frozen, staring at the paper in front of her, her mind swirling with 1,000 questions. Was this some kind of mistake? A misunderstanding? The more she thought about it, the more it didn't add up. She wasn't rich. She wasn't connected to anyone important. She was just Sarah, the waitress at the local diner. I don't know what to say, Sarah finally managed, her voice distant. Her mind was racing, trying to comprehend the gravity of the situation. This was too much for her to handle. She had always been content with the simple life she'd carved out for herself. But now, everything was changing, and she didn't know if she was ready for it. David's expression remained unchanged. You don't have to say anything right now. But you will have to make a decision soon. There are legal matters to settle. Inheritance taxes, property transfers, all of it. You'll need to decide if you want to accept or decline the inheritance. Sarah felt the weight of his words, the finality of it all sinking in. But she couldn't make a decision just like that. She needed time. Time to process, time to figure out what this meant for her future, and for the future of everyone around her. "I need time," she said quietly, her hands trembling as she pushed the will back toward David. "I need to think." David stood up, adjusting his jacket. "Of course," he said, his voice softening for the first time since he had walked in. "Take all the time you need. But know this, whatever you decide, it's going to change everything." With that, he turned and walked out of the diner, leaving Sarah alone with the will and the overwhelming weight of a decision that she was not prepared to make. For the next few days, Sarah couldn't shake the thoughts that plagued her mind. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw James' face, a man she barely knew, yet whose final decision had somehow entwined their lives forever. She had always lived her life simply, taking each day as it came, working long hours at the diner and coming home to a quiet apartment where she could unwind from the bustle of the world. But now, nothing seemed ordinary anymore. The weight of the inheritance hung over her like a storm cloud, and she found herself torn between conflicting emotions. On one hand, the idea of receiving such a fortune was overwhelming. Who wouldn't want financial security? On the other hand, the sheer absurdity of it all gnawed at her. Why would a stranger, a man who had walked into the diner just one day ago, choose her of all people to leave everything to? Her head swam with questions, but none of the answers seemed to make sense. The town, too, felt different. Sarah noticed people whispering as she passed by, their eyes lingering a little too long, their voices lowering when she came into earshot. Word of the inheritance had spread quickly, as news of anything unusual in a small town tends to. The diners, the grocery store, even the post office, everywhere she went, people looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and awe, as if she had been touched by something beyond her understanding. Some even offered congratulations, though Sarah had done nothing to earn them. She hadn't even made a decision yet. It was all so surreal. The shock of it all was still settling in, and as the days passed, Sarah's thoughts were often clouded with doubt. She spent hours pacing her apartment, staring at the letter, the will, the papers that David Grant had left behind. They were official, no mistake there. But the more she looked at them, the more impossible it seemed. Could it really be hers? Was she truly ready to step into this strange new life, to accept something so significant that it could change everything? Every instinct inside her screamed that this wasn't what she had wanted, but part of her couldn't deny the allure of the opportunity. She had always struggled with money, always lived paycheck to paycheck. A life without financial strain was almost too good to be true. But at what cost? As Sarah continued to wrestle with the decision, she began hearing more about James. Word of his death had spread quickly, and there were whispers about his life, his business, and what had led him to make such an unexpected decision. People who had known him described him as a quiet, private man, someone who kept to himself. But despite his solitary nature, he had built an impressive business, one that had earned him respect in the community. Yet, it was also clear that James hadn't had many close relationships. From what Sarah gathered, he had been estranged from his family for years, his only real connection being with the town. The more she learned about him, the more questions arose. What had led James to this decision? Why had he chosen her, someone so ordinary, someone he had only met once, to be the beneficiary of everything he had worked for? The more she thought about it, the more Sarah realized she couldn't make this decision alone. She needed guidance, someone who could help her navigate this unfamiliar world of legal jargon, inheritance, and the unexpected burden of sudden wealth. She decided to reach out to David Grant, the lawyer who had delivered the news. When she called him, her voice trembled with uncertainty. "Mr. Grant, I've been thinking. I need to talk about the inheritance. I don't understand why James would choose me. I barely knew him, and now I'm supposed to accept all of this. I need help." David's tone was professional, but there was a softness in his voice that surprised her. "I understand this is overwhelming, Sarah. It's not an easy situation to process, but I assure you, James made his decision with purpose. He saw something in you that you may not even realize yourself. But I'm here to help guide you through this. We can meet and go over the details, answer any questions you have. You don't have to face this alone. The next day, Sarah found herself sitting across from David in his office, a stark contrast to the small-town diner she was used to. The sleek leather chairs, the polished wooden desk, and the quiet hum of the office made her feel out of place. She felt like an outsider, someone who didn't belong in a world like this. But as David began explaining the intricacies of the inheritance, the legal process, and the steps she needed to take, a sense of clarity started to form. The first thing we need to establish, David explained, is your intention. Do you want to accept this inheritance? Once you make that decision, we can start the process of transferring the assets. But remember, there are consequences. There are taxes, legal fees, and ongoing responsibilities. This isn't just about money, it's about the commitment that comes with it. Sarah listened carefully, taking in every word. It wasn't just a simple windfall, it was a complicated decision, one that would affect not only her but the entire community. She had already seen the way people looked at her, the way they whispered behind her back. The town would be watching, waiting for her decision. What happens if I don't accept? She asked, her voice small. What if I just walk away from it all? David paused, considering her question. If you decide not to accept the inheritance, it will be transferred to a charity of your choice, or, if no decision is made, it will be distributed to James' other assets. But I would caution against making that decision too hastily. You may find that this inheritance is not just a financial blessing, it could open doors to opportunities you never imagined. The idea of walking away seemed tempting at times, but Sarah couldn't ignore the growing pressure to make the right choice. The inheritance wasn't just about the money, it was about the responsibility, the legacy that James had left behind. She was beginning to see that his decision wasn't as random as it had seemed. Perhaps, in some way, he had known she would be the one to rise to the challenge, to take on what he had started. But could she do it? Could she live up to his expectations, take on the responsibility of managing a business, dealing with legal issues, and carrying the weight of his legacy? Sarah didn't know if she was ready for all of this. She had always been content with her small, simple life. But now, the world was opening up before her in a way she had never imagined. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized there was no turning back. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, she couldn't escape the feeling that her life was on the brink of something big. She wasn't just facing an inheritance, she was facing the possibility of transformation. A new life, a new chapter, all built on a simple act of kindness. But would she be able to handle it? Would she rise to the challenge, or would it overwhelm her? As she drifted into an uneasy sleep, Sarah knew that her decision would change everything, not just for her, but for the entire community. And tomorrow, she would have to decide once and for all whether she was ready to embrace that change. The decision weighed on Sarah's mind day after day, the uncertainty gnawing at her. She had always been someone who avoided drama, someone who took life one step at a time without pushing for more than what was necessary. But now, her life had been thrust into the spotlight, and with it, the kind of pressure she had never known. The more she thought about the inheritance, the more she questioned her own worthiness. Why had James picked her? Was it really just a random act of kindness, or was there something more to it, something deeper that she didn't understand? The small town where Sarah had lived her entire life felt increasingly suffocating. People treated her differently now. Their glances held more weight, their words more meaning. It was as if the entire community was waiting for her to make the next move, to show them that she was worthy of what had been handed to her. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight, she had always blended into the background, keeping her head down, focusing on her job and keeping to herself. But now, the eyes of the town were on her, and it felt as though every decision she made would be scrutinized. One evening, Sarah found herself at the diner, the same place where her life had taken a dramatic turn. She sat in her usual spot by the window, the familiar hum of conversation and the clinking of dishes around her offering little comfort. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, and the clatter of the busy diner only seemed to amplify the noise in her head. She stared at her cup of coffee, now cold, her fingers absently tracing the rim as her mind wandered. It was then that she heard the door open, the familiar jingle of the bell above the door announcing a new customer. She didn't look up immediately, but the sound of footsteps approaching caught her attention. She could hear the light tap of shoes on the wooden floor, and a deep voice speaking to her from across the room. "I hear you're the talk of the town these days, Sarah." She looked up, startled. It was David Grant, the lawyer who had been handling James' estate. He smiled, his eyes warm but carrying the weight of business. "Mind if I sit with you?" he asked, his tone friendly but professional. Sarah nodded, gesturing to the empty seat across from her. "Of course, Mr. Grant." David sat down, his presence adding another layer of weight to the already heavy atmosphere. He studied her for a moment, his eyes compassionate but measured. "You've been avoiding my calls," he said, more of a statement than a question. "I've been thinking," Sarah replied, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "About everything. About the inheritance, about James, about what this all means." David nodded, understanding more than she could have imagined. "I get it. You're facing a decision that could change your entire life. And I don't envy that." He paused, leaning forward slightly. "But I want to help you, Sarah. I want you to make the best choice for you, not for anyone else." Sarah stared at him, her mind racing. "But what if I'm not cut out for it? What if I make the wrong choice and ruin everything?" David's smile softened. "You don't have to have all the answers right now. Nobody does. But I can tell you this, James saw something in you. He saw something that maybe even you haven't recognized yet. And that's why he made you the beneficiary." She was quiet for a moment, her hands folded in front of her, trying to make sense of his words. "But why me? What did he see?" David sighed, sitting back in his chair. James was a complicated man. He didn't have many close relationships, but he had an innate ability to recognize people who were genuine, people who had the strength to face adversity without being consumed by it. He may have been a businessman, but he wasn't driven by money or status. He was driven by a desire to leave something meaningful behind. And he believed you could carry that forward. The words hung in the air, heavy and profound. Sarah sat back in her chair, her thoughts swirling. Could it be true? Had James seen something in her that she had never realized before? She had always thought of herself as ordinary, nothing special, nothing extraordinary. Just a waitress in a small-town diner, getting by day by day. But what if she was capable of more than she thought? "I don't know if I can do this," Sarah said quietly, the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest. "I've always just done what I needed to survive. I've never had to make a decision like this, one that could change everything." David leaned forward, his gaze intense yet reassuring. "You don't have to have it all figured out right now, Sarah. But I can tell you this, if you take this opportunity, if you make the choice to embrace this responsibility, it could change your life in ways you can't even imagine. And it could change the town too. It's not just about the money, it's about the future you could help build." Sarah's mind raced, the words reverberating in her ears. Could she really take on such a responsibility? Could she transform her life, and the life of the town, with just one decision? The idea was overwhelming, but something inside her stirred. Perhaps this was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment that would define who she was, who she would become. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice steady. "But I need more time." David nodded, understanding. "Take all the time you need, Sarah. But don't wait too long. The town is watching, and James' legacy is waiting to be carried forward. As David stood up to leave, Sarah felt a mix of emotions: confusion, fear, and something else she couldn't quite place. It wasn't just fear of the unknown, it was the fear of stepping into a role she didn't know if she was ready for. But as David walked out of the diner, his words echoed in her mind. Maybe James had seen something in her, something she hadn't yet discovered. And maybe, just maybe, this was her chance to find out what that was. The next few days passed in a blur. Sarah spent more time at the diner, trying to focus on her job, but her mind was consumed with the decision ahead of her. The townspeople's curiosity was palpable, their glances following her every move. Some congratulated her, others whispered behind her back, but all of them were waiting for the same thing: for her to make a choice. And with each passing day, the weight of their expectations grew heavier. One evening, as she walked home from the diner, Sarah looked up at the sky. The setting sun cast a warm glow over the town, and for the first time in days, she felt a sense of calm. The road ahead was uncertain, but maybe that was the point. Life had never been about certainty, it was about embracing the unknown, taking risks, and trusting that you could find your way. And maybe, just maybe, she was ready to do that. With a deep breath, Sarah made a promise to herself. No matter what happened, she would make the decision that was right for her. And in doing so, she would honor the legacy James had entrusted her with. What that meant, she still didn't know. But she was beginning to understand that the journey was just as important as the destination. And for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to take that first step. As the days passed, Sarah found herself caught in a whirlwind of emotions. The decision weighed heavily on her heart, gnawing at her with every passing moment. Her thoughts were a jumble of doubt, fear, and uncertainty, but they were now intertwined with a flicker of hope. She had always believed that life was about simplicity, working hard, getting by, and finding small moments of joy. But now, that belief seemed like an illusion. Her life was no longer simple. It was complicated, filled with questions and possibilities she had never dared to consider. The pressure of her decision was growing, and Sarah knew she couldn't postpone it forever. The small town she had always known felt different now. People had stopped whispering behind her back, but she could feel their eyes on her every time she passed by. She couldn't help but feel like an outsider in a place that had once felt like home. She had worked at the diner for years, had seen the same familiar faces day in and day out, but now, the faces she saw seemed to be judging her. Some seemed hopeful, others curious, and a few even resentful. It was as though they had already decided what she should do with the inheritance, what they thought she owed them. The pressure was stifling. Sarah had never wanted to be the center of attention. She just wanted to live a quiet, simple life. But now, her every move seemed to be scrutinized by the very people who had once been a part of her everyday life. When she walked into the diner that morning, the usual buzz of conversation seemed to fall silent. The clinking of silverware, the hiss of the coffee machine, it all faded into the background as Sarah made her way to the counter. The chatter resumed almost immediately, but there was an underlying tension in the air, an awareness that something had shifted. Sarah could feel it, could sense the weight of every glance, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. She took a deep breath, pushing down the knot in her stomach, and focused on her task. She had work to do, and she couldn't afford to get lost in the noise of everyone's expectations. As she made her way through the day, serving coffee and taking orders, her thoughts kept drifting back to James. She had learned so much about him in the past week: his quiet nature, his solitary life, and his unexpected decision to leave everything to her. But the more she learned, the more questions surfaced. What had driven James to make such a choice? Why her? Why not someone else? The answers seemed elusive, and yet, something inside her told her that there was more to this than met the eye. She couldn't shake the feeling that James had seen something in her, something she had never recognized in herself. The ringing of the diner doorbell pulled Sarah from her thoughts. She turned to see David Grant stepping inside, his polished shoes clicking on the tiled floor. His presence was as professional as ever, but today, there was something different about him. There was a tension in his posture, an urgency in his step that caught Sarah's attention. As he approached the counter, he offered a tight smile, but she could sense that something was off. He leaned in, speaking in a low voice, "I need to talk to you. It's urgent." The words hit Sarah like a bolt of lightning, and her heart skipped a beat. She motioned for him to follow her to the back room, away from the eyes of the customers. Once they were alone, David didn't waste any time. "There's been a development," he began, his voice serious. "I just received a call from one of James' old business associates. It seems there's something about the inheritance, something that could change everything." Sarah's pulse quickened as she took a seat, her mind racing with possibilities. "What do you mean? What's going on?" David hesitated for a moment, as if he were choosing his words carefully. James wasn't just a quiet businessman. He had connections that went far beyond this town. There's been some talk that his business dealings may have involved more than just legitimate investments. I'm not saying he was involved in anything illegal, but there's a lot more to this inheritance than we initially realized. The weight of his words sank in like a stone, and Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had always assumed that James had lived a quiet life, that his business was aboveboard, but now, doubts began to creep in. What had she walked into? What was this inheritance really about? Was she about to inherit more than just money? Was there a hidden danger lurking beneath the surface? David continued, his voice low and urgent. "We need to be careful, Sarah. I've spoken to the authorities, but there's a lot of red tape to navigate. If this inheritance is tied to anything shady, it could complicate things for you. I need you to understand that accepting it might not be as simple as we thought." Sarah sat in stunned silence, her mind racing with fear and confusion. This wasn't just a windfall anymore. It was a tangled web of secrets and uncertainty. The life she had imagined was slipping away, replaced by something far more complicated, far more dangerous. She had thought she was ready to take on this responsibility, to embrace the change James had left for her, but now, she wasn't so sure. The path ahead was murky, and every step felt like it might lead to something far darker than she could handle. For the first time since receiving the inheritance, Sarah found herself questioning everything. What if accepting the inheritance wasn't just about money? What if it was about power, responsibility, and danger? What if, in the end, she wasn't ready for any of it? As the weight of the decision pressed down on her, Sarah realized she couldn't make it alone. She needed to talk to someone she trusted, someone who could offer a different perspective. But who could she turn to? Her parents had passed away years ago, and she didn't have close friends in the town anymore. The only person she could think of was James' old business associate, the one who had reached out to David. But could she trust him? Was he someone she could rely on, or was he just another part of the web of secrets surrounding this inheritance? With every passing minute, Sarah felt the walls closing in. The decision she had to make was no longer just about money, it was about her future, her safety, and her sanity. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that there was no turning back. She had already taken the first step by agreeing to accept the inheritance, but now, she was about to step into a world that was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. As Sarah sat in her quiet apartment, the weight of the last few days pressed down on her like a relentless storm. The phone call with David had shaken her to her core. His warning about the inheritance had opened a door she had never intended to walk through. Every hour that passed, the more she felt the suffocating pressure of the decision ahead. She had tried to ignore the fear that had crept into her heart, but now, it felt like a constant companion, always there, always watching. The once calm, steady life she had built had been shattered in an instant, replaced by a tangled mess of questions, doubts, and anxiety. The phone call with David echoed in her mind, each word from him lingering like a dark cloud. You don't know what you're walking into, he had said. You have no idea what James was involved in. His voice had been low, urgent, but there was something else too, something she couldn't quite place. Was it fear? Concern? Or something darker? Sarah couldn't decide. She trusted David, he had been a reliable figure throughout this process, but now, there was a sense of ambiguity surrounding him. What did he know that he hadn't told her? What had James gotten himself entangled in, and how deep did it go? She stood up and walked over to the window, staring out at the small town she had always known. It seemed so peaceful, so idyllic, but in the back of her mind, she knew it wasn't the quiet place it once seemed to be. It wasn't just about the inheritance. Something was off. People were acting differently. She could feel it in the air, in the way they looked at her. Whispers followed her wherever she went, and she couldn't shake the sense that her every move was being observed. Sarah had always considered herself to be just another small-town girl, but now, she was becoming a part of something far bigger, and far more dangerous, than she had ever imagined. It was something far more complex, far more dangerous. The more she tried to make sense of it, the less she understood. And now, there was no turning back. The next morning, Sarah drove to the law office, her heart pounding in her chest. The building was tall and imposing, far more grandiose than she had imagined. She felt a wave of panic sweep over her as she stepped inside, the cold, sterile atmosphere of the office making her feel more alone than ever. She was led through a labyrinth of hallways until she found herself sitting in a plush leather chair, across from a stern-looking lawyer. His nameplate read, Thomas Carrington, and he looked at her with an expression that seemed to say he had seen far too many people like her, people who had no idea what they were walking into. Ms. Turner, he began, his voice calm but authoritative, thank you for coming. I'm sure you're wondering why you're here. Sarah nodded, her mind racing. She had so many questions, so many fears, but she had no choice but to listen. James Willard left behind a complicated legacy, Carrington continued. His business dealings were extensive, and there are matters that need to be addressed immediately. I'm afraid you are now at the center of it all. What do you mean? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, but she managed to hold herself together. The inheritance you received, Carrington said, leaning forward, is not just money. It's a stake in something much larger than you realize. James was involved in a network of investments, partnerships, and properties across the country. And now, it's all yours. Sarah's head spun as he spoke. She had thought the inheritance was just about money, just a way to start fresh, to leave behind her struggles. But now, it seemed like she had inherited a web of secrets, lies, and potential danger. You need to understand, Miss Turner, Carrington said, his voice dropping low, that accepting this inheritance isn't just a financial matter. It involves certain responsibilities and risks. There are people who will stop at nothing to claim what you now own. The room felt like it was closing in on her as his words sank in. There was no turning back. She had stepped into something much bigger than herself, and the choices she made from here on out would determine not just her future, but the future of everyone around her. For the first time since this whole ordeal had begun, Sarah understood the gravity of her situation. The road ahead would be perilous, filled with twists and turns she couldn't even begin to imagine. But one thing was clear, she had a choice to make. Would she embrace this new life, accept the inheritance, and fight whatever forces stood in her way? Or would she walk away, return to her old life, and leave behind everything she had inherited? As the weight of her decision settled in, Sarah knew that her life would never be the same. And the consequences, whatever they may be, were hers to bear.